While Washington was celebrating its economic victory last month, something historic just happened in the shadows. China didn't just catch up to the United States in global trade dominance, it surpassed it. And the proof? A $6.4 trillion shift that most Americans don't even know exists yet. Now look, this isn't about who has the bigger military or the flashiest tech companies. This is about something far more dangerous. Control. The kind of control that decides which countries eat and which countries starve. And by the time most people realize what's happening, it'll be too late. Here's what they're not telling you on the evening news. While every major outlet is obsessing over tariffs and TikTok bans, the real war was already lost. It was lost quietly, methodically, in ports, in trade agreements, and in currencies that most people can't even pronounce. You've probably felt it, haven't you? That nagging sense that something's shifted in the global order. Maybe it's the price tags at the grocery store. Maybe it's the way foreign leaders don't pick up the phone for Washington anymore. You're not imagining it. The data just confirmed your worst fears. China's total trade volume in 2024 hit $6.4 trillion. The US? $5.8 trillion. Let's be real for a second. That gap isn't closing. It's widening. And this isn't just about buying and selling widgets. This is about leverage. This is about who gets to write the rules for the next 100 years. But before we get into how this happened, we need to understand when the tide actually started turning. Because this didn't happen overnight. This was a calculated strategy that's been in motion for over 2 decades while America was looking the other way. Let's go back to 2001. America just experienced the worst terrorist attack in its history. The response? 2 decades of military intervention in the Middle East, trillions of dollars spent, thousands of American lives lost. And while that was happening, while our attention and our resources were focused on Baghdad and Kabul, China was quietly executing the most ambitious economic expansion in human history. They weren't invading countries, they were buying them, port by port, railroad by railroad, mine by mine. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative. Western media barely covered it. The few outlets that did called it China's Marshall Plan or dismissed it as a debt trap scheme that would never work. Fast forward to today, and that scheme has connected over 150 countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. We're talking about $1 trillion in infrastructure investment, roads, ports, railways, power plants, all built by Chinese companies, financed by Chinese banks, and staffed by Chinese workers. This wasn't just about construction contracts, it was about creating dependencies, and it worked. Take Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor alone represents $62 billion in investments. That's not a loan, that's not aid, that's ownership. Chinese companies now operate the strategic Gwadar port, giving Beijing direct access to the Arabian Sea and a gateway to the Middle East. Or look at Djibouti, a tiny nation in the Horn of Africa that most Americans couldn't find on a map. China built its first overseas military base there, right next to the American base. Not by accident, by design. Because Djibouti sits at the entrance to the Red Sea, one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. Whoever controls Djibouti controls access to the Suez Canal. But that's not even the craziest part. While China was expanding its influence in developing nations, it was also quietly taking over in the West. In 2016, a Chinese state-owned company bought a controlling stake in the port of Piraeus in Greece. Greece, the birthplace of Western democracy, now has its largest port run by China. And it's not just symbolic. Piraeus has become the fastest-growing container port in Europe, handling millions of containers every year. Every product coming from Asia into Europe has a good chance of passing through Chinese-controlled infrastructure. That's leverage you can't buy with military might. Now let's contrast that with what America was doing during the same period. In 2021, President Biden announced a massive infrastructure bill. Finally, right? Except it took months of negotiation, political infighting, and compromise to pass a watered-down version. And even after it passed, the implementation has been painfully slow. Projects that should take 2 years are taking 5. Budgets are ballooning. Meanwhile, China is building high-speed rail networks that span thousands of miles in the time it takes us to approve a single highway expansion. The Port of Los Angeles, America's busiest port, is operating with technology from the 1980s. Cranes that should have been replaced decades ago. Systems that can't handle modern shipping volumes. During the pandemic, ships were stuck waiting outside the port for weeks because we simply didn't have the capacity to unload them fast enough. China's port of Shanghai, fully automated, operating 24/7, processing more cargo in a month than LA handles in a year. This isn't just an efficiency gap. This is an infrastructure crisis that threatens our entire economic future. And here's where it gets really interesting. All of this infrastructure, all of these ports and railways and trade routes, they're not just about moving products. They're about data. Every shipment that passes through a Chinese-controlled port generates data. What's being shipped, where it's going, who's buying it, and how much they're paying. That data gives China an unprecedented view of global commerce. They can see supply chain vulnerabilities before anyone else. They can predict market trends. They can leverage that information in trade negotiations. It's economic intelligence on a scale that's never existed before, and we handed it to them. Now let's talk about something that should terrify every American who understands how power really works. The dollar. For over 50 years, the US dollar has been the undisputed king of global finance. It's been the world's reserve currency, the medium for international trade, the safe haven in times of crisis. Countries had to hold dollars to buy oil, to trade with each other, to participate in the global economy. That gave America extraordinary power. We could print money without immediate consequences. We could impose sanctions that would cripple entire nations. We could borrow at rates that defied economic logic because everyone needed dollars. That era is ending, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. In 2023, something unprecedented occurred. For the first time in history, the Chinese yuan surpassed the dollar as the most used currency for cross-border transactions in China's trade with Belt and Road countries. Think about that for a second. Countries are choosing to trade in yuan instead of dollars, not because they love China more than America, but because it's more practical. If you're buying Chinese goods, selling to Chinese markets, and using Chinese infrastructure, why convert everything to dollars first? Why pay the transaction fees, the exchange rate risks, the compliance costs? Just use yuan. It's faster, cheaper, and easier, but it goes deeper than convenience. China has been systematically creating alternatives to dollar-dominated financial systems. They launched the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, as an alternative to SWIFT, the messaging network that underpins most international transactions. When the US imposed sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion, cutting them off from SWIFT, China offered an alternative. Now, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and dozens of other countries that are either sanctioned or worried about future sanctions are diversifying away from dollar dependence. They're holding more yuan, more gold, more anything except dollars. And then there's the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Together, they represent over 40% of the world's population and about 26% of global GDP. For years, they've been talking about creating their own currency for intra-BRICS trade. Most analysts dismissed it as fantasy, as impossible to coordinate. But in 2024, they made serious progress. They're not launching a single currency yet. but they're enabling direct currency swaps, bypassing the dollar entirely. When Brazil buys oil from Russia, they're doing it in yuan or rubles. When India buys coal from South Africa, same thing. Every one of these transactions is a tiny wound to dollar dominance, death by 1,000 cuts. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia for a moment, because this is the perfect example of how the ground is shifting beneath our feet. Since 1974, Saudi Arabia has sold oil exclusively in US dollars. That's the petrodollar system, and it's been one of the main pillars supporting dollar dominance. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. That created artificial demand for our currency that had nothing to do with our actual economic strength. In 2023, Saudi Arabia announced they would accept yuan for oil sales to China, not as the only currency, but as an option. That announcement barely made headlines in American media, but in financial circles, it was an earthquake. China is the world's largest oil importer. Saudi Arabia is one of the largest exporters. If those two countries are trading in yuan, that's billions of dollars in transactions that no longer support the petrodollar system. And it's not just Saudi Arabia. The UAE, Russia, Iran, and even some African oil producers are accepting yuan. Again, not exclusively, but enough to matter. Each one of these arrangements is a brick removed from the foundation of American economic power, and we're acting like it's not happening. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that we did this to ourselves. We weaponized the dollar. For decades, American foreign policy has relied on economic sanctions as a tool of coercion. Don't like what a country is doing? Cut them off from the dollar system. Freeze their assets. Ban their banks from SWIFT. It's effective in the short term, absolutely. But it also creates a massive incentive for every other country to find alternatives. Because if the US can freeze Russia's dollar reserves on a whim, what's stopping them from doing it to anyone else? Every country watching is thinking the same thing. We need to reduce our dependence on a system that can be weaponized against us at any moment. China saw this opportunity and seized it. They're positioning the yuan not as a weapon, but as a neutral alternative. They're not threatening to freeze assets or impose sanctions through their financial system. They're offering stability, predictability, and freedom from American political interference. And for many countries, especially those in the global south that have been on the receiving end of US sanctions or structural adjustment programs, that's an appealing pitch. We're watching the slow-motion collapse of the financial architecture that's defined the post-World War II order, and we're too distracted by domestic politics to do anything about it. Now, let's shift gears and talk about something that hits even closer to home: manufacturing. The physical production of goods. This is where China hasn't just caught up to America. They've lapped us multiple times. In 1990, the United States was the world's largest manufacturer, producing about 20% of global output. Today, we're at about 16% and falling. China, they're at 28% and rising. But raw percentages don't tell the full story. It's not just that they make more stuff. It's what they make and how they make it. During the pandemic, when supply chains collapsed and there was a global chip shortage, American auto manufacturers had to shut down production lines. Cars were sitting in parking lots, fully assembled except for the chips needed to run their computer systems. We couldn't make our own chips fast enough, and we couldn't import them because everyone else needed them too. That shortage cost the US economy an estimated $240 billion. And what did we learn from that crisis? Apparently nothing, because we're still dependent on foreign chip production, still vulnerable to the same disruptions. Or look at electric vehicles. Tesla, the most American EV company you can imagine, builds more cars in China than in the United States. Why? Because the entire supply chain is there. The lithium mines, the battery factories, the component suppliers, the skilled workers. everything. It's not just cheaper to build in China, it's faster and more efficient. Elon Musk has said publicly that his Shanghai factory can go from raw materials to finished car faster than any of his American facilities. That's not a labor cost issue. That's an infrastructure and supply chain issue, and it's a problem that can't be fixed with tariffs or trade wars. Here's something that should make every American policymaker lose sleep. China produces about 80% of the world's solar panels. They control about 60% of global lithium production and refining, the key material for batteries. They dominate rare earth minerals, which are essential for everything from smartphones to military equipment. We talk about energy independence and green transitions, but we can't achieve either without materials and components controlled by China. If they decided tomorrow to restrict exports of rare earth elements, our entire tech sector would be in crisis within months. Our military, which depends on rare earth magnets for guided missiles, radar systems, and jet engines, would face critical shortages. And it's not just about what they produce, it's about innovation. China files more patents than any other country in the world now. They're not just copying Western technology anymore, they're creating it. Chinese companies are leading in AI research, quantum computing, green energy technology, and telecommunications. Huawei, despite being blacklisted by the US government, is still the world leader in 5G technology. Their equipment is cheaper, more efficient, and in some cases, more advanced than anything Western companies produce. Countries around the world are choosing Huawei not because they trust China more than America, but because it's the better product. Now you might be thinking, okay, but we still have Silicon Valley. We still have the best tech companies in the world. Do we though? Let's be honest about what Silicon Valley produces these days. Social media apps, streaming services, gig economy platforms. These are valuable, sure, but they're not transformative in the way that manufacturing capacity and infrastructure are. You can't build national power on TikTok alternatives and food delivery apps. China has all of that too. Plus, they're building the physical systems that will power the next economy. They're installing more industrial robots than the rest of the world combined. They're building more renewable energy capacity. They're launching more satellites. They're testing hypersonic weapons and quantum communication networks. The CHIPS Act, passed in 2022, allocated $52 billion to revitalize American semiconductor manufacturing. That sounds like a lot until you realize that China is spending over $150 billion on the same goal. And they're not just subsidizing companies, they're building entire ecosystems, universities, research labs, supplier networks, everything needed to create a self-sufficient tech sector. We're bringing a knife to a gunfight and wondering why we're losing. Let's talk about something that connects all of these threads: trade partnerships, the economic alliances that determine who's in and who's out of the global economy. For decades, America has been the center of that system. We created institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization. We wrote the rules. But China is building a parallel system, and countries are choosing it. In 2022, China launched the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, the largest free trade agreement in history. It includes 15 countries across Asia and the Pacific, representing about 30% of global GDP. The United States were not even in it. We pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the agreement that was specifically designed to counter Chinese influence in the region, and now we're on the outside looking in. Every country that joins RCEP is reducing tariffs with China, harmonizing regulations with Chinese standards, and integrating their economies more deeply with Beijing. That means when those countries need to choose between American preferences and Chinese preferences on everything from data privacy to labor standards, they're going to lean toward China, not because they love authoritarian governments, but because that's where their economic interests lie. This is soft power at its most effective, and we've completely ceded the field. Or look at Latin America, America's supposed backyard. China is now the largest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Argentina. They're building ports in Ecuador, railways in Bolivia, and telecommunications networks across the continent. Meanwhile, U.S. engagement with Latin America has been declining for decades. We show up when we want something, lecture them about democracy and human rights, then disappear until the next crisis. China shows up with investment, no political strings attached, and asks what they need. It's not hard to see why they're winning hearts and minds. The same pattern is playing out in Africa. China's trade with Africa hit $254 billion in 2021. The U.S., about $64 billion. China has built more infrastructure in Africa in the past 2 decades than the West built in the entire 20th century. Roads, hospitals, schools, stadiums, power plants. Yes, there are legitimate concerns about debt and sustainability, but from an African perspective, they're getting something tangible. When Western countries engage with Africa, it's usually through NGOs and aid programs that come with conditions. When China engages, they build things. They create jobs. They transfer technology. It's not altruism, it's strategic, but it's effective. Now, here's the part that should keep Pentagon officials up at night. All of this economic integration creates military implications. China doesn't need to invade countries to extend its influence. They just need to be indispensable to their economies. If you're a small country in Southeast Asia and China is your largest trading partner, controls your port, and finances your infrastructure, are you really going to side with the United States in a conflict? Even if you wanted to, could you afford to? That's the power of economic dependency, and China has been building it systematically while we've been distracted. But let's bring this back to the $6.4 trillion number, because that's what this is really about. That figure represents China's total trade in goods in 2024. It's not just a bragging point, it's a measurement of economic gravity. The country with the most trade is the country that sets standards, determines regulations, and shapes the future of commerce. When you're the biggest buyer and the biggest seller, everyone else has to play by your rules. That's the position America held for decades, and now it's slipping away. And here's what makes it even more concerning. China's trade is diversified. They're not dependent on any single region or partner. They trade with Europe, with Africa, with Latin America, with Asia, with the Middle East. If one market slows down, they have alternatives. American trade, on the other hand, is heavily concentrated with a few partners. Canada, Mexico, China, and the EU make up about 60% of our trade. We're more vulnerable to disruptions, more exposed to geopolitical shifts. China has been building redundancy into their system, while we've been banking on stability that no longer exists. Chinese AI companies like Baidu, Alibaba, and SenseTime are developing facial recognition systems, natural language processing, and autonomous vehicles that rival or exceed Western capabilities. The Chinese government is using AI for everything from traffic management to social credit systems, giving them real-world testing at a scale we can't replicate. And because their tech sector works hand in hand with their military, innovations move from civilian to military applications almost seamlessly. In the United States, there's often tension between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. In China, there's coordination. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Can the United States fight back? Can we reverse these trends? The honest answer is yes, but it would require a level of political will and long-term thinking that we haven't seen in decades. It would mean massive investment in infrastructure, not the watered-down bills we've been passing, but genuine commitments on the scale of what China is doing. It would mean industrial policy, which is a dirty word in American politics but is exactly what we need. Strategic subsidies for critical industries, reshoring incentives, R&D funding at levels that dwarf what we're doing now. It would mean fixing our education system to produce more engineers, more scientists, more skilled workers instead of drowning students in debt for degrees that don't lead to productive careers. It would mean rethinking our approach to immigration, recognizing that America's greatest advantage has always been our ability to attract talent from around the world and making it easier, not harder, for skilled immigrants to come here and stay here. It would mean tax reform that encourages long-term investment over short-term stock buybacks. It would mean antitrust enforcement that breaks up monopolies stifling innovation. It would mean trade policy that actually protects American workers without starting trade wars we can't win. But most importantly, it would mean accepting an uncomfortable reality. The unipolar moment is over. The era of unchallenged American dominance ended, and we need to adapt to a world where we're not the only superpower. That doesn't mean retreat or surrender. It means competing smarter, playing to our strengths and building alliances that can counter Chinese influence. The difference between Britain and Rome is that Britain managed its decline relatively gracefully by building institutions and partnerships that outlasted its empire. Rome didn't, and the Dark Ages followed. Which path America chooses in the next decade will determine not just our future, but the future of the global order. The $6.4 trillion figure isn't just about trade volume, it's about momentum, it's about trajectory, it's about a country that has a plan and is executing it while we're still arguing about whether climate change is real or if vaccines work. China's leadership thinks in terms of decades and centuries. Our leadership thinks in terms of election cycles and cable news hits. That's the fundamental difference, and until we fix it, we're going to keep losing ground. If you want to stay ahead of this, if you want to understand where this is really heading, keep an eye on three things. First, watch the yuan-dollar exchange rate. When that starts to shift significantly, it means the financial order is changing faster than expected. Second, watch BRICS expansion. As more countries join and as their alternative financial systems become operational, dollar dominance erodes further. Third, watch semiconductor production. If China achieves self-sufficiency in advanced chips, the balance of technological power shifts fundamentally. Those are the indicators that will tell you how this plays out. The empire that controls trade doesn't just control goods, it controls information, it controls innovation, it controls the future. And right now, we're watching that control change hands in real time. The question isn't whether China has beaten the US in certain metrics. They have. The question is what we do about it, and whether we have the courage to make the hard choices necessary to compete in this new era. Because one thing is certain, ignoring it won't make it go away, and by the time the mainstream media catches up to this story, it'll be too late to change course. The decisions that matter are being made right now, in boardrooms and government offices most people will never see, and those decisions will shape the world your children inherit.